then turn off the projector so that you can sit here without being blinded, and we'll get all the four speakers up here, and I hope have a lively discussion through to lunchtime. So our first speaker is Michael Berenger from Cisco. Michael.
Thanks, Andrew. I feel like Captain Kirk here, mission control. My name is Michael Berenger. I'm with Cisco currently. I used to be with Dante, so I used to be quite familiar with the NRN environment. I have lost a little bit of touch in the meantime. That was 7 years ago, but I still think I know the National Research Networks reasonably well. In the meantime, I've been working a lot on security, which is my main focus, security on core networks, that is, i.e. not security as in how to configure a firewall, rather security in how to run a network in a secure way. Now, what are NRNs for? And there are several discussions going on at the moment within the NRN space and with the commercial community like Cisco, how to take forward research. We have seen over the last years that the national research networks have taken up a lot of new initiatives, one of the big ones being lambda switching, optical connections. A lot of this is being demonstrated here. There's a lot of move, if you want, from the national research networks, as I see it personally, down the OC stack. If you think about the OC stack, and like 10 years ago, everybody was working on layer 3. These days, a lot of people would probably say they're working on the optical layer and trying to manage the optical layer and do things like that. Now, I actually have a session in the next slot, and which is very related, about what are NRNs for, more or less, where I'm saying there's something really weird happening. Because what I'm seeing in the academic environment with the national research networks is that the whole discussion is going down the OC stack. We're discussing on how to manage lambdas, how to switch them transparently, how to manage them. Whereas in my other life, where I work with commercial providers, with large telcos and internet service providers of this world, actually what they are doing is they're doing the opposite. They're going up the stack. So in that world, they are talking about service control, about application level filtering, application level control of the user. So you, the NRN community and the universities, you serve one set of end customers, and the commercials serve another set of end customers. And if I'm not mistaken, and maybe you can correct me, there are really two completely different tendencies in the commercial and academic world. Now, in the afternoon, I can go in more detail what I mean with that. But basically, my main emphasis for this point, what are NRNs for, is, first of all, NRNs have to provide normal, standard working connectivity to universities. In that they are, if you want, a service provider to the universities, a service provider who must provide working services, i.e. it must be stable, robust, available, and if there's downtime, this is considered unacceptable. In that sense, an NRN is like a normal commercial service provider, right? There's hardly any difference in that. There is, of course, the additional point that a national research network should adopt, that is foster research into networking. And now, we as in the community, are doing a lot of research in networking, if you want, in the lower layers at this moment. There is also, I won't dispute, there is stuff going on in the upper layers as well, right? People are, NRNs are deploying PKI infrastructures, for example. So there's certainly also upper layer initiatives happening. But the main focus and the reason to be, if you want, for a lot of NRNs is right now seems to be making optical VPNs, making GMPLS control infrastructures to control optical infrastructures, and that is something that I find interesting. My question to you is, are we as an industry actually spending enough research on layer 3? We are thinking a lot on how to map IP onto all sorts of weird things. We are also spending some time on the applications, I do admit that. But are we actually spending enough time in rethinking what is layer 3, in rethinking, hang on, this IP protocol has actually a lot of shortcomings. which we have, in the meantime, more or less happily accepted. But what are we doing to solve that? Now, if we are trying to do research on layer 3, we have a problem. We cannot do it on the running network because the running network needs to be available, right? The running IP infrastructure. So you can't just swap out router code and put new router code on there and do experiments with that. So we need another infrastructure to carry out layer 3 research, if you want. However, what I see on many of the research projects right now is that we are doing research on optical with maybe some control plane layer 3. So my statement, and this is with what I want to finish here, is I think we are not spending enough time on researching the IP layer.
Okay, thank you. Sally? Slide? Yes, please. Okay. While we're doing the changeover, if anybody standing at the back wants to sit down, there are, I think, 7 seats down here, which is 1, 2, 3, enough for one each. On the other hand, if you feel you've sat down for far too much of this week and want to be healthy, then feel free to stay standing. We won't take it personally. Okay.
Very strange way.
Good view. Yes, no? Mac?
Okay, so it looks like my presentation is going to look very poor. It was done on a Mac. And this is the first time I've seen it on Windows. But there you go. Let's see what happens.
Okay, the next speaker is Professor Salim Bhatti from the University of St Andrews, who is a network researcher. So a very nice link provided by Michael. Thank you.
Okay, so in fact, I'm going to be slightly boring and agree with your last point, but go slightly beyond it as well. Okay, so first of all, what do I do? So I work with network systems. I like to perform real experiments. And in order to do that, I like to build things. So I'll build test beds. I'll write software. And then I'll try to make it work. And I'll make observations. I'll make measurements. And in the course of that, I will break things. That is the nature of the work. And in fact, arguably, I'll learn more from breaking things through the course of my work than through doing anything else. When things don't work, and you dig down and find out why they don't work, is when, arguably, for me at least, I gain more knowledge and make progress. So, this is the part of NREN that I am particularly interested in. Okay, the research part. In fact, NRENs have a pretty difficult job. They have lots of different requirements from users within the research community. And I know this has happened in the UK. UKERNA have, in the kind of recent past, collected the user community together and tried to get the requirements out in order to provision the next UK national network, SuperJanet 5, which starts rolling out later this year. And it was clear from that there was a wide range of requirements. Okay, so someone doing work on network systems research, what is my interest? And so what is my bias that I would like the NRENs to address? Well, let's have a look at some of the items that I've come across which are important to me. The first bullet is, in fact, quite visible here at Torino. There are a lot of people doing work on various grid-related technology, lots of things prefixed with e-health, e-science. And all these systems may require the development of new networks and new distributed systems. Okay, and some of these are pretty large and pretty complex. And when you get to that level of scale and complexity, although it might seem natural to put it into a simulation to see how these things will behave, because of the scale involved, you can't always model accurately in simulation. Software systems aren't very precise, regardless of what the computer science community may think. Computer science is not a very exact science, okay? Not as precise as, say, mathematics or physics or chemistry. So sometimes the behavior that comes out of the system is emergent from the system when you put it together and try and use it. Okay? So when it comes to really large, complex systems, you have to basically build them, do real experiments, and see what happens. Okay, so what you may need to do in order to do that is take a test bed or a network of some sort, make controlled changes to it, which includes putting in things that are non-standard. Okay, there may be non-standard protocols. You may be using, for example, security protocols that are non-standard, software, new kernel images, software that isn't stable, software that you know will break. You may have new firmware in bits of new hardware that you're trying to develop. All these things just make network administrators have heart attacks because you can just throw the site security rules out the door. Okay, what do? You want to do this work, but I've certainly gone to systems group in 2 different institutions now, and they're like, there is no way that's going on our production network. Okay, and you could argue quite right too. They have to run a safe and reliable system for the other users. The other thing we need to do is monitor and measure the network when we put our systems onto it. And there are very few networks that have the correct instrumentation, have the correct tap points, where you can measure and monitor the things you're interested in. And putting those in is often subject to, again, security constraints and is seen to be disruptive. But in doing these things, you're going to make mistakes. And as I said, when you make mistakes and you break things, that's when you may learn. But you need to be able to do that without inconveniencing other users. So these things are disruptive, but there are no large experimental test beds widely available that people can use. Okay, so people may build something in the lab. Maybe they have a dozen machines. Maybe they're lucky enough to have 2 dozen or 3 dozen machines. But there are no realistic scenarios to try out software and systems that may eventually need to run on hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of nodes or end systems simultaneously. Where is that test bed? It doesn't exist. Okay. Now, in fact, I think there is recognition of this worldwide, and certainly there are moves afoot in the US. There's the Genie program. Well, it actually hasn't been funded yet, but there's a request to try and get those test beds in place. So, if you like, my answer to the question, what are NRENs for, is NRENs are for providing a platform for disruptive distributed systems and networks research. Stuff that involves changing the systems that make up the networks that we work on. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that was agreeing with Michael or not. Thanks. We're not all supposed to agree. It's very boring if everybody agrees in panel sessions. Okay. So no, I will not turn that off. That's how I turn it off. And then I can see the audience again. Okay, thank you. Our third speaker, I'm not sure if I'm moving up the stack or down the stack, but is Miroslav Milinovic from the University Computing Center at the University of Zagreb in Croatia. So another type of user.
Yeah, and just to introduce myself, I would say that I was there when CARNET, Croatian Academic and Research Network, was born. I'm not the mother or the father, but I consider myself one of the ones who were really present at that time. So I could speak as a user, but I could speak also as a person that was heavily involved in setting up what the CARNET is today. So maybe I'll sometimes run into the wrong position saying we when I speak about the NRNs. Another disclaimer is that I'm tempted to say that each and every of the plenary speakers up until now said something about the role of NRNs. And I tried to take some notes, so I'm going to say that Mr. Nelson said that we should, a mistake, you should educate policymakers, be unbiased source of technical advice, act like canary in the coal mine, whatever it means to each of us, test new technologies and standards, and now I'm repeating the people who were speaking before me, and promote open standards and open source. Probably I would stick to that as a special message to you. Further on, Egon Verhaeren said that we have a unique position to do the experiments, and I also agree with that fully. This is the stuff that the commercial providers, as we heard before, are not able to do, at least because they are not in a position to destroy their own production service because of some stupid experiment. And finally, Endol said that the challenge for us is the user adoption. And this is something I would like to insist on, because at the very beginning, Carnet started to push the technology to the users, and then it comes out that dissemination is a problem. So my bumper sticker for the NRN would be research, develop, deploy, disseminate in the bold letters, and then maintain and support, and when you think you are finished, then turn to the very beginning. This is a circle. When you end up with only maintaining and supporting things in your network, then you are doomed. Something is essentially wrong, because you should be researching and developing new stuff. Of course, for that purpose, NRN should have, I don't know, 300, 500 persons on board, and this is bad. Definitely, NRNs are there to seek for the partners, and I would say especially in academic and research community. And why that should be done? Because I think that NRNs have a unique type of users. Our users actually are demanding and creative, and you cannot normalize them. Their needs, and as my predecessor said, the research problems or whatever are quite different, and the commercial sector cannot cope with that. Because users, I think users in commercial sectors are somehow normalized. They have average needs and service that works as an average for everybody. But then if you have additional needs, additional ideas, then you are somehow and sometimes doomed, at least in the position where I am sitting. What else should I say? I think that NRNs are definitely not the ISPs in the definition of that word, because NRNs should do the ISP business for the academic and research community plus additional services. And this plus is something that should be measured and should be valued. And why do the academic community need us, you would say? That's another question. I would say, yes, they need us, because look at the big companies. Let's say Cisco. They have operations all across the world. But each and every of these, let's say, nucleuses, departments, whatever, has its own IT support. No. They have the generalized IT support solution for each of every of them. So they are not using the different ISP service in different countries. They are harmonizing their needs. In the same way, I think the academic community should harmonize their ICT needs throughout the NRN, and this is the only solution. But of course, using the users as the partners and using the academic community research potential in order to meet all the needs. Otherwise, I do think this is a situation in which we don't have a good solution. Finally, we nowadays see that the NRNs have a change in type of users. Aside of A and R, there comes the edu, school children, and so on. I think that we will, in future, have to deal with the quality of servers for different categories of users. I think that the academia or the researchers will ask for their fair share of the stake of the whole NRN services. And I think that this is a kind of challenge that NRN should be able to answer to. Before it will be too late, before the biggest and most important research users will try to turn to somebody else. And yeah, we do have a, and this will be my final word, we do have a controversy in experimenting and researching versus the production. Nowadays, more and more of NRNs are talking about their production, quality of service and all of this, and this also could be broken, so you sometimes have to have an additional national network only for production stuff, and this is also kind of a challenge. And this is something. For my bumper sticker would be research, develop, deploy, disseminate, maintain, and support, and when you think you are finished, then turn back, but be careful and take your partners, especially from the academic and research community. Okay. Too many words for a bumper sticker.
I was trying to visualize a circular bumper sticker. I think it needs to go all the way around the car, perhaps. And yeah. And I was a little worried, actually, by the suggestion that we should be canaries in a coal mine, because as far as I know, the purpose of the canary is to die first. Sorry? Yeah, okay. Canary is not happy, no.
If my daughter saw me with this Madonna microphone on, she'd think I'm even sadder than she already thinks I am. Okay. Not least my son, who thinks I'm a techie these days. Sorry, do you want to introduce me?
I was going to introduce you. Well,
okay.
To you. Our final speaker is and then we start with you lot. Final speaker is Tim Marshall, who is the Chief Executive of UKernet.
And thank you for coming. I did wonder on a hot morning how many people would want to come and listen to this subject. It's fantastic to see so many people have got an interest in it. As I've said, I'm not an optical engineer, in fact, far from it, although throughout my whole career I've used technology, very sophisticated technology. In fact, I was one of the first people to use high-definition television, and I won't tell you how many years ago that was. But my background is I've been in the BBC, and I ended up doing big events, a bit like the sort of things Anne was talking about this morning. And then I went to Walt Disney and worked all around the world, responsible for their TV production everywhere outside the States. Then moved back into e-learning, or I say moved back, transitioned into e-learning, which is a sort of journey of how I got into this position. And I think the fact that I'm the first non-technologist as such, and it's terrible to put us all into these packets, but that's part of our business, isn't it? To be the first non-technologist to be appointed to this position, I think probably says something about the people's thinking behind our NREN in the UK. What I thought I'd just try and do quickly is take you through a few experiences that we have to show you where we stand as an NREN, but it's interesting, there's a lot of harmony with what I see elsewhere. The scope of our business is right from very young children who are doing the BBC Jam project, which is a very interactive learning resource, which is delivered across the network, right up to the usual suspects of particle physicists and radio astronomers, who all say they want massive amounts of bandwidth, but I haven't yet quite seen it coming, so I'm sure it will come, but we always try and stay one step ahead of that curve. But that is a big scope to deal with, and I think, as many of you know, it's not where NREN started, but it's certainly a place that I hear other colleagues internationally are going. You will also notice that that's our mission statement, and it doesn't contain, I don't think it does, no, it doesn't contain the word network, and that's probably another interesting observation. Supporting UK competitiveness and learning, two important things there. Learning is really throughout the whole piece of the educational spectrum, whether it be for specific purpose or whether it be just for developing one's mind culturally. Competitiveness can have two meanings. It was put in there because we deal with the skills sector, the part of the education economy that trains people with skills, but there's also another very important point that you can read into that. One of the leading research vice-chancellors in the UK said to me as I left the room after telling him a little bit more about where we were going, he said, the one key thing, Tim, you must always do, and that is continue to give us the broad bandwidth that we need to do research with. Because he said when he goes in to compete with others to pitch for research, if he can say, I already have the bandwidth, I have the capacity, it's an incredible USP on those that say, oh yeah, well I can maybe get the bandwidth if you give us the contract. Those of you that buy things know how important that is. So that's very important. And then the other key word I'd put in there is enable. One of our policymakers gave a paper on a piece of policy about ICT in education in the UK, and she used the word enable, and she defined it as meaning things you can't do without. So I thought strategically it's not a bad idea to put that in your mission statement. So if she reads it again, she'll say, well, I can't do without UKERNA. But actually, it has more to it than that. Just to go very quickly through our offering, at the base and the foundation of it all is the network. And as you've heard already mentioned, we're just in the process of implementing a new network. And that network has the capacity to carry production traffic. And I'm looking at some of this high-definition television may become production work. So it needs to be reliable and resilient. I don't want anyone to bust that while they're doing their things. But at the same time, we need a network that can also allow people to break things. And one of the tensions, and I've been talking with Andrew about, I think there's some substance in this whole discussion of creativity and security. I don't think they're necessarily opposites, but I do think we need to understand how can we give real scope so that people can either break things or experiment, or they can really push the edges, but at the same time we can have whatever security means, but it means that those places where people do need robust and resilient services, they can be ensured of having them. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And then middleware. That's something where I felt very strongly we should be going, and in the last year, UKERNA have got into that space with Shibboleth being the people who will manage the federation in the UK. But what's more exciting to me about that is that we're both working with our colleagues at the JISC on HE and FE, that's the higher education and the further education sector, and our colleagues at Vector on the schools. And I regard that, I don't know whether your governments have similar things, but the big thing in the UK at the moment is joined-up government, shared services. And I'm very excited about that because that's one example of where pulling those two things together in the NREN means that there's money going to be saved, and it also means that people are not going to go up different cul-de-sacs. So that's very important. Cul-de-sac, lost in translation, it means a road that comes to a dead end. Sorry, I must remember, use these bits and pieces now and again. Is it French? Well, it's Welsh as well, I think, cul-de-sac-y. Applications and services. So on top of the network and the middleware, we're also looking at applications and services, and obvious examples of that are things like the Janet video conferencing service, where that has become much more of a production service, and we seek to run that. I'll come to the policy of what we run and what we don't run in a minute. And then that's a real hot button for me as well, and I think it's a theme that I've seen come up at this conference time and time again. If you've got these bottom three things, which are truly fabulous, and people don't know about them, they don't know how to use them, they're not very user-friendly, then we've really failed and we've wasted a lot of the money of those that funded us with. Very important then that we seek to educate and train people effectively, and I heard Surf talking yesterday about training teachers. Absolutely fundamental. I often think, when I was in the television days, I've seen all these people raise the glass of wine and the champagne and everything when the shoot finished, and I always used to say to them, but is it any good or is it crap? Tell me, because we shouldn't be raising the glasses yet. And we have to be careful about that. We get a technology solution done, and we all raise the glasses and have a few drinks. And then we have to ask the question, is it actually any good? Very important. Now, I'll try to answer the question, and I just put a few thoughts down on what an NREN does and can do. We've heard about that. It provides, in quote, super capacity, and it's the sort of image I said to you about the Vice-Chancellor. What it means is my job is to stay ahead of the demand and make sure that when Salim comes to me with some massive request that he really wants to go totally anarchic on, we can provide that. Now, he'll probably record that and hold it back against me at some time, but that's very important to me. That's the business I'm in, making sure that he can do fabulous things for the future of the world and driving technology and research forward. Operate and deliver services. That's a grey area where each person has to make their own decisions as to where they go and what they operate. I'm very strong, and it's in our corporate plan, that I'm very strong in collaborating with the commercial sector. I don't see any point us trying to reinvent things that the commercial world do so much better. Let's work in collaboration with them, and commercial partners know that that's my very strong policy. Capture needs and drive development. Again, the NREN is placed in the center very often, and it's a good position where it can capture needs and also drive development. We as an NREN don't do all our own development, and again, NRENs differ in different countries because of the policy and the strategic way in which they're organized. We're slightly different to some others. We're certainly a little different to SURF in the way that they're organized, But within certain parameters, capturing needs is very important, whether it's the NREN itself or that some collaborative partner that does it. Capturing needs is essential. Aggregating at the center, I do believe that we're very well positioned to get the best value out of the commercial buying, and there are various examples that we've done just by fairly loose collaborations with commercial suppliers where the community can benefit and the commercial supplier can benefit. The key thing you have to watch there is to make sure you don't get into state aid issues and that you're not lining the pockets of shareholders unreasonably. So it needs a certain amount of transparency. Be a clear and single voice to suppliers. If I was a supplier and I was pitching for the SuperJanet 5 network, it would be a very expensive thing and a high-risk thing for me to actually go around the community and try and work out what the needs were in order to pitch for it. The advantage with the NREN is that the NREN, having 1 or 2 feet in that community, is able to go and gather those requirements, to consult and gather them, and then meet with suppliers and have a consolidated voice that it can speak and develop the pitch. Very important, I think that is, and I hope that members of the community feel that's a benefit as well. Facilitate sharing, again, we've heard that. It's about sharing knowledge, it's about finding best practice, about telling other people what's worked and what hasn't worked. Educate and train the users I've spoken to, and then our strategic objective 5, which is very important, is about, if we've got all this knowledge, it's very important then that we influence the policymakers, whether they be politicians or other international bodies. So that's really trying to just answer the questions of what an NREN does, in my view. I'll just three quick challenges. The users are getting more and more power, they're getting younger and younger. Some people are having nervous breakdowns about the amount that their students know about networking and about computing, and they wonder how they can continue living. I think we've got to accept that, and anyone who tries to put barriers up is going to fail. So we've got to understand how we can work with this increasingly literate body of students and users who very often know more than we do. They certainly know more than teachers do. And the teachers that are successful in this area are the ones that, like the judo player, use the weight of the kid and they go with it. And they use that to their advantage. They don't fight them. Big challenges there. Again, we've been hearing about this throughout the conference. Our traditional business models are no longer viable. In all sorts of areas, we're seeing that. You know, people immediately rush to voice over IP. They think, oh, it's going to save money. You suddenly find it doesn't. You suddenly find it's more expensive. Authentication, you'll find that there will be interesting business models that will develop in that way. But the traditional, if you learn from other industries, you learn from television, and you see the way spot advertising on free-to-air television, that whole industry is suddenly destroyed by the opportunities that IP television, for example, brings to it. So throughout our game, the business models are changing and they're being different. So let's not just say you can't do it because it doesn't fit the business model, and it's a challenge for our commercial suppliers as well. But let's say, how are the more innovative ways in which we can arrange this? Who can we partner with? How can we collaborate? And then finally, this comes to all of us. It's all happening much faster now. The 4-minute mile, when it was broken, look how fast they go now. And I don't know how much faster they can go. But the important thing that everything around us is happening so fast, sometimes maybe we even have to consider, do we take a technology leap and miss one iteration out? But there are key decisions being made. As people often hear me saying, the theory of network-enabled capability has really 3 components. There's information, there's technology, and there's people. And we've got masses of information even being generated while we've been here this week. Look at the amount of information that's been generated. We've got masses of technology. We've been hearing about that, more than we can cope with. I mean, who here really uses Microsoft Office to its full capacity? I doubt we use 10% of it. And yet it's all sitting there waiting to be used. So the thing that's holding it up is us, the people. And I think that's the real challenge as to how visionary we're prepared to be, how risky we're prepared to be. I mean, we do actually live in a world where you can be a bit risky, so I don't really understand why we should be too conservative. And if I can just leave you with the thoughts of the master himself, if you've never read his biography, he's the most interesting man, the man who increased the value of GC when he was president and CEO. But he did make the point. He was a man who was always going, is this working? No, it's not. Well, we need to change it. Let's make it work. And if we find that things are happening faster on the outside than they are on the inside of our organizations, of our NRENs, then I would suggest the risk is that the end for us might be in sight. Thank you.
think we now have a... No, just about as long as planned. Can I ask the four speakers to switch it on? This is where I claim not to be a technologist either. Thank you. Can I ask the other speakers to come up? Any questions, comments, points you'd like to seek views on, or whether any of the earlier speakers would like to respond to points that were made later? If I can ask, we haven't done through the rest of the conference, but since this is a discussion session, it probably helps if you say who you are and where you're from, if that's okay. So, any questions? I will run around with a microphone.
Hi, I'm Simon Line and I work for Switch, so I operate the network part of an NRAN. Just to start this up, I like the last presentation a lot. I'm not sure how many people in the room understand what a USP is. So maybe we need interpreters for, not a UPS. Everybody knows what a UPS is. I think it's a unique sales proposition or something.
Correct.
So, unique selling point. Okay, yeah, thanks. But anyway, that was fun. I really like. I would like all NRAN higher ups to have such a neat vision. I think it's a good thing to have. For me, probably the most challenging talk about the second one of is. I'm sorry, Salim. Thanks. About being able to break our networks. Of course, we don't like our users doing that, and then we have these excuses for not letting you do that. I am a computer scientist, not a network, never been a network researcher, but I have a lot of empathy, I think, for people who want to do research in this area. We found that even where we don't let you break our networks, I found that there are like simple things we can do to help network researchers. For example, a couple of years ago we started giving access to researchers to our usage data in a very granular way, and that has been feeding many scientists since. I think it's like 2-digit number of term projects and diploma theses and so on. That was a big success. And also we can give talks about operations, and people seem to enjoy that. So that is something I would encourage my peers in the NRANs to do more. Go towards these groups who do sometimes very good network research, and that sometimes suffer from lack of just talking to people who run these things. I found that's very successful in general. I'm sorry that doesn't really isn't really the response that you probably would like to hear.
I think, just one point I would make there. You raise a very good point about user data, and Andrew's probably going to jump down my throat now about some Data Protection Act or something. But what I recall is when I was in the subscriber television business, I did a deal with Sky for the Disney channels, and what interested me was how precious to Sky was their subscriber management system. And in fact, if you look at their business models, that's where their whole value comes from, that they know who you are, they know what you're doing, and they know what you're watching. And you raise a very good point that here within our own remit, within our own property, if you like, is a massive amount of data that to our commercial colleagues or anyone else would be incredibly valuable. So I think you raise a very good point that that's something else that is of significant value in an NREN, is the knowledge of usage.
We have, of course, in this whole, in the first three presentations at least, made a statement which is basically a contradiction in itself, right? NRNs should provide a stable service and it must be disruptive. So now the traditional approach to that has been provide a second network, and now with all the lambdas we can do that. And then we are going to be back, in my opinion, into the days of ATM, like 10 years ago when we had ATM testbeds, where we also had this opportunity with much lower bandwidth, of course, but separate networks where we could do research in what happened. nobody was using them. Since nobody was using them, you couldn't really do research because you need user data on it. So it is a real chicken and egg problem that I'm not sure how to resolve really.
Can I just respond to that? I think one of the reasons that the ATM experiment failed was that IP users just don't like ATM.
But it was free bandwidth, right? It was free bandwidth. It was not used as ATM. It was used as an additional, it was used as a VPN. It was not used as ATM technology to a large extent.
Hello, Hello, Econ Vragen, Surfnet. I still like to get an answer. This is the problem, but there's also another basis, because we're here talking about NREN EN, and it looks like Salim is actually asking for more attention to the R, but we see that we need the production services, especially for the E in NREN EN. So one approach, like you said, would be to have a test network, but then there's the chicken and egg problem. But I'd like to hear, especially from you, what's the direction? Is there an idea of doing that again? Are there other ideas? You work at the National Research Networks. I'm too. I have my own ideas, but I'd like to hear your ideas about what you think could be done to solve that problem with, on the one hand, the operational demands for especially the educational services, and on the other hand, having the freedom to do research, especially for the research networks. So just forcing you to an answer instead of saying there's a problem. You as experts probably have an opinion.
If you're talking to me, I'm actually not from an NREN, so Exactly.
Well, I think, yeah, I'm from an NREN. I have a CTO who answers these sort of questions. So I think I'll pass on to one of my colleagues from the community who knows what he's talking about.
Well, I think it's a hard thing to answer. I think several, at least, European countries are trying to address this at the moment, and you've heard people talk about various things and describe various networks. And there are networks in the US, there's the Lambda Rail, etc., Internet 2, that are trying to have separate research infrastructure. I think the problem is because the testbed of the past is no longer available. The testbed of the past was the Internet. I mean, I remember, so it can't be hugely long ago, being able to send code to somebody else that we were cooperating with in Europe or in the States, and being able to run things, new things across the Internet as a whole. Now you can't do that. It's critical national infrastructure in many places. So that has gone. And it's hard to make any change at all. Okay, so it looks like you do need something that is physically separate. Okay, I think that's one part of the answer. It has to be physically separate in some way. Now, how that physical separation is achieved, whether it's physically separate optical fiber or it's separate lambdas with the appropriate equipment provisioning, that's in a way a service provisioning issue. And I'm sure there are technical details there, but I think there has to be some sort of separation between the education and the research infrastructure to allow the really disruptive research where, in fact, I think a lot of the innovation will come from. Because at the moment, you're constrained to making, if you want to play nicely with the rest of the network, you have to make small deltas that don't harm the rest of the network. If you want to make step changes, then I think you need something that's separate.
Right, but I guess that also means that the National Research Networks would want that each institute have two connections.
Right, okay, so
And then pay for one, get one free, or different business models. But you definitely agree that we should work on it and not just give up and say we can't do it?
I think it would be a huge mistake just to say, oh, can't do it and wash our hands of it. It's clear from a lot of the talks today that increasingly the work that people are doing. I think there's a talk later today or tomorrow on, you know, arts and humanities starting to use networks and distributed systems now. It's becoming prevalent, you know. We are in a networked community, right? It's becoming part of people's lives. So to hinder the research in that at the time where it's becoming more and more a part of our lives is a mistake.
Good to have this come up. I've got two already in the queue, and then I'll come to you, Jürgen. If I can throw in something to muddy the waters on that, I've actually been thinking a bit about it, as Tim mentioned. I don't think it's as simple as research versus production, because I think you mentioned the arts and humanities. They are doing creative stuff at one level. You are doing creative stuff at one level, but you actually need your platform to be extremely robust so that when it breaks, you know it was you that broke it. So I don't think it's a straight dichotomy, and I think life is even more challenging, more of an opportunity than we thought it was. Mike.
So I would fully agree with the last person talking. We need to have the separation. I think there's no way out. We need a stable infrastructure. We have gone in the past already the step of providing a secondary infrastructure for research, so this is as such nothing new. I think what we have failed in the past is to actually move then proper network traffic onto the research traffic. And I have no idea how to do that in detail, but there are certainly various ways. Taking two connections to the end user is one way, but you could also aggregate that at the university level and maybe let routing fail over or I don't know. I mean, there must be ways where you can, at some point after you have developed a secondary infrastructure, separate, breakable, where you actually route production traffic onto it with a capability of falling back to the proper network in case of problems. Because you do absolutely need production traffic to make your research, in my opinion.
Mauro Campanella from the Italian Research Network. I followed the discussion, but at the same time I think that one should make a clear distinction between the goals and how to reach the goals. For example, to me, a technology agnostic approach to networking is quite fundamental. I've seen various essays in the last time that says we have to tweak the network according to a certain application, because the application is the real thing. I think that going back to history 15 years ago, 20 years ago, what actually happened is that the success of Internet is because it was application and technology agnostic. This is personally my preferred way of deploying a widely scalable and research independent thing, because I can't be so smart to outwit all my users. So who am I to decide which is the best network to build? But that means that the principles we have to follow have to be put clearly aside the goals we have to reach. This is why I'm against, for example, to a vertical approach to applications instead to a layered approach. So I would like to have a comment on you to these, because the tools you use do influence, in my opinion, the results, the final results. And what I've seen is that only if you have an agnostic approach and you provide capacity and you provide, yes, a research network at the same time, which we are providing now using whatever technology is available from WDM to MPLS, doesn't care, and it works, like you can see here, then you get the preferred result.
Okay, that's an interesting comment, and I think it comes back to Andrew's comment earlier about it's not a simple dichotomy, certainly in certain areas of research. So I understand what you mean by having the layering that's horizontal. You have the clean separation, and you can put people into nice compartments and draw nice diagrams that show that everything's fine. But, you know, for systems research, you do need some interaction across the layers, some sort of vertical interaction, in order that for a particular system, you can have some interaction with the network. Now, that may be through some sort of well-defined interface and done in a well-defined way. And indeed, the interaction may be technology independent. You just require, we're probably digressing into a technical discussion rather than a more general discussion. It will probably require some way of controlling how that's done. But I think to have vertical communication, certainly for my area of research, is very important.
Can I just have a fast reply? Well, I'm not saying that I want to make compartments. Exactly the opposite. What I'm saying is that defining a clear interfaces between the different areas in the vertical stack, then you actually have the possibility that on your machine, on your laptop, is the real responsible of the end-to-end communication. It boils down to the fact that I want a very stupid network and a very clever user. I don't want the opposite. But that can be easily done if TCP runs on that machine, but it doesn't run on the routers. This is what I meant. I hope it helps.
Right.
No? Oh, no. There's a request for NRENs to be stupid, I think.
Dave Wilson, HEANet. I agree with everyone. In particular, I agree with Michael very much that there are significant challenges remaining at layer 3 to be solved that are not being solved. And every time Jeff Houston opens his mouth, I worry because he seems to come out with something else that by the end of the talk everyone is convinced we have yet another limitation of IP that is not being fixed by industry, and it doesn't look like commercial pressures are going to fix it. And then I agree with Miroslav that we have the responsibility not just to deploy but also to disseminate. I think that NRENs have been instrumental in deploying the new technologies we need to run, in that if you walk into any NREN's office in Europe, you can expect to plug in a laptop and get IPv6 connectivity. You can expect multicast. You can expect gigabit access. You can probably expect at this stage a light path of some form or another. But we do not see that deployed toward the end user so much as it's been identified. The problem is this: there are all these things that we should do, and in order to deploy them end to end, we need the cooperation of our customers. Now, I have some customers in this room. However, they have very good reasons for not doing so, in that they don't have a mandate to deploy this. Their mandate is to deploy a particular service, which is already there. Now, if we don't fix this problem, and it seems that no one else is going to, but if we don't fix these problems that Jeff notices, I think that we are going to be in deep trouble, not because I think we will see the death of the internet, but I think we will see something much worse, which is the internet will continue exactly as it is, with exactly the same number of IP numbers on exactly the same routing protocols and so on, and will become much, much more boring, and we won't need to have conferences like this. So my question is then, it still remains that the funding we get and the mandate we get from our customers is to provide a particular service, and they have the same mandate. Can anyone tell me, for all these things I should be doing, where can I get the mandate to do them?
Right, I can't answer your question, I'm afraid, but I will pick up on a couple of things you said. One of them, which I think is really important, especially to enable the disruptive research to be done, is collaboration between industry and academia. If there is a good idea that comes out from the collaboration, certainly me, I have no real intention or capability of commercializing that. I'd be a very poor businessman. But you need, if there is something good that comes out, you need partners there to be able to be able to take that forward. So I'm in agreement with that. The other thing that's key is what you said and what I was hinting at earlier, but it's worth making explicit, is this risk of the whole thing ossifying, the whole thing just becoming stagnant, because nobody wants a change because they're so reliant on it working just as is for the critical things that they need to do with the network as it stands. And I agree with you again, there is a danger in that happening.
I think yes, funding and mandates are always interesting. If I can just separate them out to two different things. I don't know if I've got colleagues here from our funding bodies, but just looking around. But my perception, having been in this just a year, is that in the research areas, while we always want more money, for key and significant projects, money seems to be found in one way or the other. And I think, you know, and everyone, particular researchers, always want more. That's human nature. But there does seem to be money, and there does seem to be a process where that mandate can be got to get the money for research. What I think is a more interesting area, and one that I'm very sensitive to, is when you, and if you, it tends to be more on the E side, the education side, is when you go down the road of some of these services, the thing to look at is one just replicating here something that the commercial world can do, or are you actually adding value and making it different from that which they offer that actually adds value to your user community? And I mean, one of the things you have to do is to go out and talk to your users. I mean, I've had two things this morning about Moodle and about people having different views on Moodle in the community and indeed in the Department of Education. So one's got to go out and do that. And then the grey area I find is, does the NREN then proceed to actually, how far down the road of developing and delivering a service do they go, or do they partner with someone? My inclination is, if I can find the right commercial suppliers, I would seek to partner with them such that they can deliver something that the user really needs, but equally they take on some risk that is appropriate to commercial business. And if one can come to those sort of partnerships, it's not so much a mandate you need, but you can facilitate solutions to come about. But I think what I'm hearing, I mean, there's obviously a lot of interest in the research thing, and I think what I'm hearing is you have to ask this real question, is as we go forward in the future, does the R and the E actually sit together? It's a good question, because if you look at, if you just break down, you know, I'm a P&L person at heart, and if you just break down our NREN, you see that the whole drive really comes from the R. The whole reason, the mandate for doing it, is from the demand for research to have something that the market still doesn't provide. And the E bit, you could have a much longer debate as whether the market can provide it or how that can be supplied. So I think that's an interesting point for this group, is to, do we see a divorce coming up? Can R and E live together forever, or is something going to change?
Can I just quickly respond to that? So, the overall tension between education and research, one other way of looking at it is try and picture what happens if we don't provide the support that the research community is asking for now. What will happen in, say, 5 or 10 years' time if that isn't there? I don't know the exact answer. I'm pretty sure it won't be a nice picture.
It'll be a disaster.
But, so that's one way of looking at it. What is the cost of not doing it?
One sentence to just, what I'm really saying is that those that are not in research should be very grateful to the research community, because a lot of these other benefits actually ride on the back of it. If you had a world where you didn't have research, which is obviously not possible to conceive of, but say you did for a moment, I doubt whether we would fund our education network in the way we do, or even develop it to be as sophisticated, not at the price at the cost we do anyway. Sorry.
Just a short comment on getting the main mandate and this A in NRN. Sometimes, okay, there are essentially two models how we deal with the technology. We either users pull the technology out of what is offered, or either you push the technology. That means you take the mandate by yourselves, reserving the rights to be utterly wrong and pay for the consequences. Sometimes when water is still, when nobody asks for the new services or development, maybe this is the right time for pushing things, for taking the mandate in your hands. This doesn't look too democratic, but somehow this is in line with the research, because researchers actually don't ask for the mandate to tackle with the network and destroy it eventually, to see how it works really. And on the other hand, there are some things that could be researched only on the live network. As long as you move to the upper layers, from the middleware upwards, you would see that only the live network with all the data and services could be the source of the valuable information. The rest of it are only pilots in which you have some data, but they are somehow not the full information you would like to know about the size of your network, about the number of services, the way how they react under some conditions, and so on and so on. So in some cases you should push and, you know, reserve a right to be wrong.
I'm Vasilis Maglaris and I'm the chairman of the Ender NPC. I would like to make a position in both of the points that you were addressing for the last 20 minutes or so. The first is that we definitely need to stress the educational component in our networks. The reason is political, and the reason is that if experience showed, at least in the last few years, that whenever you need political support to get your NREN running, to get your NREN be considered as a funded national facility and not something which is given out to an ISP or to whatever, you need some political support. This political support comes from a broad basis, which is parents of school kids and students, educators, and so forth. This is a tremendous base. I believe that, you know, people in this room are probably young, don't have kids in here, but but at any rate, I mean, all of us that do have kids realize how important it is to provide this kind of infrastructure accessible to our kids. Second view is that in order to keep our NRENs up and running, and with political support and so forth, we'll have to keep their pre-normative nature. The pre-normative nature means that we'll have to be ahead, and we'll have to be able to experiment also what you call disruptive technologies on them. How do we do all those things? How do we give services to primary schools, and how do we do disruptive research on those networks? Well, we have some experience which is called virtual networking. There are virtual overlay networks. Probably most of you in here are familiar with the Planet Lab experiment. There are about, I believe, 600 Planet Lab sites around the world that do some virtualization at from the IP level to the application level, and in there you can do actual experiments in real production traffic, in the real internet, without destroying the internet, without disrupting other users and so forth. And this is now been, I think this thing, people are thinking of, policymakers are thinking of generalizing it and to make it into a very, very large project. In the United States, for instance, the NSF just announced, it's deliberating on a project, a big project, $6 million probably, called Genie. Genie is exactly that. Virtualization of research networking, virtualization of research and education networking, so that educators can do their jobs, researchers can do their experiments, and all of them will not interfere with each other. So virtualization is one thing. Education is something that we definitely need to support if we want to survive.
Can I just come back on two issues there? First of all, Planet Lab. I agree with what you said, that you do need the education and research to go together, first of all. But just a couple of points of clarification. First of all, Planet Lab has been successful, but Planet Lab does not allow you the kind of resource control that you need to do systems research. In fact, I can point you to papers now, I can't remember in my head, people saying exactly how Planet Lab's going to fall over soon, because it just can't cope with the way that people really want to run experiments. You can't have low-level resource control. Genie and Find, on the other hand, are addressing exactly the points that we're both agreeing on. So that is true. And again, as far as I thought it had been approved. In fact, I found out recently the Genie Find funding has yet to be approved. So I think, again, the main point here, there is a growing realization that this needs to be done. It's kind of weighing up and trying to deal with these arguments of education and research and how they can both go forward together, really.
Yeah, I think all I would say is I would still go back to what I said, in the sense that it is de facto essential that research has a dedicated, a network is set up to enable research. I think that's a put, and it will be a lost leader. It will be not one that you necessarily see a return on in financial terms. I understand fully that education gets votes, because as I look at the Department of Education in the UK, you see the higher education people who are big brutes, they're big tough animals in the jungle, and they get through with influence. You then get the schools who, as we've been told, have the votes of the people, and that's why politicians pay so much attention to the schools. And you get the poor old skills sector that gets lost in the middle. But I think the point I was making is, while de facto a research education, a research network, I think we're pretty clear there is one way of doing it. There are certainly people abroad. I happen to think that, I'm with you, that the education bit joins on well and it makes a lot of sense. But there are others who I'm sure would put up arguments for separating them for all sorts of, not least, political reasons. I don't see that on the horizon, but I could see scenarios where people could argue that.
I just want to clarify on one thing here. When we talk about research, we are talking about two levels of research, and I think we understand, but I just want to make sure everybody understands that. We are talking about supporting researchers, as in astronomers, as in physicists, and so on, to conduct their experiments over a network infrastructure, which is actually research using the network, basically. So this is supporting research with infrastructure. There's the second part of research, and that is what I was trying to say at the beginning, and that is something that, in my opinion, is not addressed today. Genie does address it partially. The research of the network itself, the research on what will the next internet look like. The internet has a lot of issues. Jeff Houston is pointing them out all the time. A lot of us are aware of them. We need to research in that space. So what is Genie is doing in the US, we are actually starting a project here in Europe called Engine that is also trying to build up a second infrastructure to do research for making a network protocol, basically.
Yes, sorry. Being one of the few people beside Ty, you might suspect that I'm from the funding side. No, practically, for us, the research networking is always two things, a network for researchers and research on networking. So what is called Genie, we have been investing for a long time. We call it now EFI, a European Experimental Facility for the Future of the Internet, and that is highly talked about in the preparation of 7th Framework Program. That's all fine, and we got the message. I would strongly advocate against the separation of the R and the E in NRENs. If you look at Korea, Japan, that operate separate infrastructures for these networks, it's probably not very cost effective and difficult to sell to taxpayers or people like us. But I would advocate that the E stands for more than education. It could stand for e-health, e-science, e-libraries. So there's much more. It's a whole range of things that NRENs can expand into and support the scientific community.
Move on to next question, since I still have 3 in the queue. I know how routers feel now.
Thanks, Andrew. Mike Norris is my name, from the Irish Research Network. Just some very brief points. I think it's worth remembering that in this continent, when we talk about research and education networks, we're also talking about something else, and that is the commodity internet. There are other research networks which don't provide that service. So the RNE really stands for our constituency, not our functionality. Our functionality is broader than that. And I suspect that it's based on history, in that in the early days when a lot of NRENs were formed, there wasn't a competitive market there for commodity internet service. I suspect that it's there now in most of our countries, and I wonder, what would the panel think about divesting that particular function and letting regional networks and indeed institutions get it themselves, as they do in other countries. That's one point. The second thing is, again, from history, I suspect that many of the NRENs started with a top-down model. In other words, they were formed because of pressure from the top, or because of incentives from the top. And I think we still see that in many of the newer countries now, which are perhaps accessing to GÉANT. The first thing is they must have an NREN, and it's not formed by any sort of physical process within inside the country. It's formed from outside. It's an outside requirement. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm just saying that it's there. And I would say that it's important now for NRENs, as time goes on, that they be more bottom-up. And I think the panel has said this. We've got to listen to the members. We have to pay attention to Bernhardt and major stakeholders like that. That's important too. But we have to remember our basic constituency and get more closely in touch with those. The final thing is I would agree that the research component does predominate, and again, that's no bad thing, and I agree with the conclusions that people have come to from that the education sector benefits from that. No bad thing there. But let's also remember that we're still there for other things for our clients. We're there as brokers as well. And we need to examine that, because we're now talking about outsourcing a lot of our services. Do we still need to provide commodity internet? Do we still need to be there as a cost-sharing mechanism among our clients for money dispersed from the stakeholders? Do we really need that? There is a vibrant market out there now, and I think we should be aggressive in not just collaborating with it, but in divesting to it. And maybe focusing on education and research. Thank you.
If I may start with that last thing, I think I said that the answer to that question would be yes or no. Actually, I have to rephrase the question again to state my point. I think that the NRNs are here to be a kind of ISPs for the academic and research community. I compare that with the global companies in the world, and I do think that this community needs a kind of harmonization, a kind of a filter that puts together all of the needs and finds the best solution in order to enable, I use the word enable from your slides, to enable the collaboration, because the most precious thing of the internet is not the information source, it's a perfect collaboration tool. So I think this is the reason ISPs will never, the NRS will never become simple ISPs and commodity, internet commodity providers, because the collaboration as our constituency sees it is different than the collaboration of the average user on the internet. I think that demands are higher. The creativity of the users that are using the real tools and the network is quite differently positioned. And I'd say that the reason would be, the answer would be different to yours, that we do still need to be a ISP for the academic community, and we'll never lose that job. In fact, if we lose that job, then the internet would become a commodity like today radio or television is. You don't have radio society, although there was one 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and we still have internet society or whatever. So we'll be out of the business as soon as the NRNs are not needed anymore. My position, okay, maybe wrong.
I think Jack Welch would agree with you that, and I think that brings an interesting point, that nearly all of us in this room are at different parts of this journey. So different things are happening to us depending on where we are and the circumstances we're in. But I mean, Jack Welch would have agreed with you that actually things are changing quite a lot faster outside than inside the NREN thinking sometimes, and commodity internet is a challenge, and who knows where it's going to be in 2 or 3 years' time. I think the important thing is about staying one step ahead. You mentioned about regionalism and centralism, which is something that interests me greatly. I actually don't have any vested interest who does it. I'm not into empires because I've been around a bit and I know that large head counts are frankly a pain. It's not something that anyone wise would go for. You want to keep your head count down because people are the trouble always, you know. But the important thing to think is as we go forward, what are the things that we don't need to do any longer? Because I do believe there are things that we can look at that we can say, actually, the market does provide these things far better. One example of my old industry, television cameras, video cameras. BBC has a research and development organisation, very good one, cutting edge in many places. But they made a bad decision. They went on designing cameras long after Panasonic and Sony were making stuff that was better than they have. Frankly, it destroys their brand. They don't look good because other people are doing it better from the market. And I come back to use that word brand. Each of us as NRENs has a brand value. We stand for something. We stand for values which we make a promise to our users. I actually don't think our users, unless they're a little bit sad, are really too worried how we source some of those things. If we can give them the robustness, the resilience, and fulfill their needs and more, however we do it, should not really be a concern to them. So I think that's where we've constantly got to be brave and thinking that some things which were precious and essential and core to our operations even 5 years ago, we must always challenge ourselves to say, actually, is this where our time and resource is best spent, or should we now be moving on and letting a, quote, commodity supplier, albeit a bespoke application of that commodity, come in and supply that need? I think if we don't think like that, we are at risk of getting left behind.
My name's Ingrid Malva. My daytime job is being a Federation Identity Management Manager for the Norwegian National Research Network. When I speak to users, and not least people who put applications out on the net, the internet is the web, and the web is the internet. And when you've been speaking about internet research, what the NRENs need to do, it sounded like the internet still was this weird communication facility we used a couple of years ago, and that's not true anymore. Or rather, maybe it's true for us, but it's not true for the majority of our users, because one of the advantages of being an NREN is that we get new users, and they don't know what the world looked like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. The users flow through the system within 3 to 5 years normally. And to them, the internet is the web. I'm lucky. I get to work with middleware, the glue that holds the universe or the universities together. And I'd like some comments on what the position of the National Research and Education Network should be with regards to that transition that's happened in the past few years.
I'm not sure you mean what I understood. So let me quickly double check. The internet is the web, so are you saying one of the issues we are facing is that a lot is channeled through web, TCP port 80 to be plain clear? Is that the issue, and other applications on the network are forgotten, or?
You illustrate very nicely the point I was trying to make, because that's how we perceive reality. But for the users, they live in their web browsers. So to them, the internet is the web. And they don't care what port it goes on. I mean, the only reason Skype goes on port 80 is that it's open, because we blocked all the other ports for them, because otherwise they would destroy the network.
So this is an interesting point, and that is a point that you observe generally on the internet. Everything is going on port 80. So if you want to develop a firewall these days, in the old days, it was great to distinguish various ports. These days, what you really need to do is take port 80 and completely parse the stream, because anything could be in there, right? And we are part of that, right? We put IPsec in port 80 because then we don't have problems with firewalls. We do all sorts of dirty tricks to make use of that as well. This is what I would say, and that is what I meant at the very beginning. On the commercial world, in the commercial service provider world, this is being realized, and the commercial providers are now trying to add value. Now, of course, they don't mean to be nice to us. They mean to increase their revenue. So what their motivation behind it all is, they want to provide you web portals, and so this is going towards centralizing everything on the web. And basically locking the user into this framework and offering services that only this service provider offers in this way, so that the user is locked into them. Now, of course, this is something in the NRN space that you can absolutely and should absolutely not do, right? The internet is great because it allows us to do everything. And this is something that we, in my opinion, we need to in quote, fight against. This is a very difficult fight, though, because a lot of the stuff has good justifications, right? Firewalls have good justifications in many environments. So how do you actually fight that? That's a really good point. And that is something where I think we also need, in this point, we need to actually maybe take a step back at this point and say, okay, there are reasons why the internet has developed this way. There are reasons why everything is in port 80. How could we start maybe from scratch, do something new, and avoid this happening.
Other panel wish to comment? No? Okay. We probably have time for one more question.
Sure. This is Javad Burman from Cisco. Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. Going back to your point, a problem with Planet Lab and any kind of overlay is actually not having to the underlying resources, and that has been recognized as a major problem. And Genie is exactly to solve that issue. And I also want to add that National Lambda Rail in the US is now going to provide those resources and provide what we call the underlay to things like Planet Lab and other similar projects. So you can actually do systems level research and have access to the underlying resources, not just bandwidth, but also the buffers and the computing engines on the forwarding plane and so forth. And although Genie technically is not funded yet, but with the resources in US and now with the engine project in Europe, we can actually get Genie started. And I think that's very important to recognize, because that egg and chicken problem by getting the applications or having a separate test bed could actually be addressed through that very quickly, now that we have the Lambdas and the basic infrastructure in place.
That was a comment. Probably is time for one more question.
Hi, JP Velders, University of Amsterdam. We keep talking about everybody tugging and pulling at different levels and having to do all kinds of stuff. For me, one of the things vendors also have to do is to get vendors to implement new stuff so that they can keep ahead and create demand for certain stuff, because applications do not come around by themselves. You need to have something, and you need to spur people to think about them and to think, hey, they have this new thing, you can do stuff with it. Because you always need to have people who have that little twist in their mind to use stuff. But I always see admins as a pyramid. Something really new is being done on top, that's really new. Then you try to disseminate that, and you could say you do it through research, education at some point, but you try to acquire new technologies, new mindsets, and you try to disseminate that. In essence, an NREN is a super university with a special task to enable the other universities to do their job and to also have knowledge flow through a complete society. How do you view that as a role?
So someone's trying to wind me up on the last question, are they? If you said, what is my impression of this sector, having come from a fairly brutal commercial world in the last year or however long I've been here, I'd say it's slow, it's indecisive, it's run by committees, it's full of politics. So you're probably right that it's more like a university. I'm seeking to run an organization that's going to deliver on time stuff that Salim wants and stuff that the teachers in the schools want. And so you're likening it to a university probably starts to make some hairs prickle on the back of my neck. We've got lots of universities. We probably don't want one more. But what we do want is an organization that in a business-like way can deliver the needs that the universities and the academics and the schools, and I mustn't forget the FE because I feel passionately about the skills sector, all the needs and benefits that they can get from national research and education networking and all the services that sit therein, and all the best relationships that I can get with the commercial world. So the commercial people that are here know that UKERNA has an open door to the geeks from the commercial companies to come and talk with my geeks and sit in rooms on hot days when they could be out sunbathing, and they sit in there talking about optical engineering and all sorts of interesting layers that we haven't yet heard of. That's what they love, and we're open to engage with that. And I hope that responds to the part that you were talking about. But equally, and again, if you talk about every NREN is different, so the position, the sort of remit I have is that we have, if you take R&D, we have rather more D than we have R in the NREN in the UK. But the important thing to me, and I've spent quite a lot of time working on a blank sheet of paper development, one of the things that I think is you can still put some commercial and business-like discipline, but while still allowing the freedom to happen within that development. So clearly there are some things you're going to rule out at an early stage. as to whether you should proceed with those for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of evaluation reasons. And then you go further down the route, and what I am very happy to entertain is an attrition rate, that you know out of these 10 ideas, you expect to have a hit with 2 of them. I wonder where I'm getting this thinking from. But actually, I think it maps right across into this world we're in. What I do not want is people who say they have academic freedom just wasting public money when there's clearly, now you wanted me to be controversial, I'm saying that, where there's clearly no, and I'm talking about the D, not the R, in the D, where there's clearly no user need for it, or the commercial world has probably actually provided a better solution or as good solution already. So it's a sort of response on a hot button that I can go on for a long time about.
Fortunately, we haven't got time. Thank you. I did see a note passing which suggested that we have a word from our principal sponsor before I thank the speakers.
Well, I did mention this already during my last comment. We are running a project, this Engine. It's called Engine. It was mentioned several times now, to do this type of research on what's the next infrastructure going to be, what's the next internet going to look like, because this is something we feel we have a critical need for. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd also like to thank you, because it's been a very good interactive session. I was slightly alarmed when the speakers ran out of their prepared material with an hour to go. I don't think we've run out of the material that we could have covered anything like, so I hope the discussion will continue. Thank you very much.
Right. Right. That's how this will ever get at me, I know.
Do you remember when we were renamed from NRNs to NRENs? Because probably you weren't there yet, but when I started to work in this area 9 years ago or so, we were called NRNs, and there was no E. And then some people decided, well, we have to do the E too, otherwise we don't get funding. Switch doesn't really do E, but we have now the tagline reads National Research and Education, but we don't really provide service outside of universities. So
my point is this, and I'm totally for cross-funding. I don't have a problem with it in the public sector, but if